Now, in the kind of Russian-Ukrainian historical experience with these sort of, I don't want to say genocidal tendencies. That was kind of the first thought I had, but let's talk a little about the Holodomor, or Holodomor. I'm probably butchering it. How do Ukrainians, or at least the Ukrainian historical narrative, what's that versus what the Russian historical narrative? And by that specifically, I mean, is it blamed kind of on Stalin? Is kind of a Stalin thing, or is it blamed on Russia? Right? Was it a kind of a Russian thing from the Ukrainian
Okay.
perspective?
I mean, those are great questions. And those are the questions which, historians grapple with, or the Ukrainians grapple with. I mean, I should mention I'm on the academic board of a new Holodomor museum that, is partly built in Kiev. And, I assume will be finished at some point. I mean, that part of it's already there, but this is a new kind of building. And we talk a lot about, historical background, what kind of things you show, what's necessary to talk about. And there's some disagreement. Many Ukrainian historians now and then there's a kind of split. I don't know what this will look like after the war. I mean, we can talk about this. Things are changing,
Hmm.
in Ukraine right now. But this is before February 24th, right? That I'm talking about. There's a kind of split between those Ukrainian historians, and the split, is not quite so severe in the West, but still, there are different emphases in how people go about looking at it. And the split is essentially between people who believe that the Holodomor, which is, we should explain to your audience, I'm
Yeah.
sure not everybody knows, was the kind of terror famine, a genocidal famine of 32, 33. There was famine throughout the Soviet Union, but in Ukraine it was worse, and something like 4 million people died in that famine. 4 million Ukrainians died in that famine. The numbers are also contested, I should say. Some Ukrainian historians now are saying it's 11 million, which
Hmm.
is just a huge number. And, they're doing demographic work and other kinds of work. I mean, these are very legitimate people who are doing this work. But the rest of us still think 4 million is the right number. But it's hard to know. These things are really hard to know, and all these numbers need to be subjected to historical, periodic historical and demographic examination. Anyway, long and short of it is, Ukrainians consider it a genocide. I consider it a genocide. Some of my colleagues, and when I say genocide, I mean a purposeful attempt to break the back of the Ukrainian nation, as such, as I explained in the definition. Some of my colleagues in the Soviet history field do not think it's genocide. They think there was, famine all over, and this may have been a little bit worse, but that's because Ukraine was a little more agricultural, and that Stalin was just being Stalin, right? He was trying to collectivize everybody's agriculture and stealing grain from everybody. And I think that's wrong. I think it was a much more serious and purposeful attempt, to attack Ukrainians as Ukrainians in that in the Ukrainian Republic. And there's evidence for that. I won't go into the whole set of arguments. So the question you asked, was it Stalin or is it something deeper, is also a hard one. Because anti-Ukrainian actions on the part of the Russian government go back. And there was famine in Ukraine in the beginning of the 20s. In fact, some people will say this famine that came in the early 30s, was just another episode in the Soviet system trying to get the Ukrainians and try to put them in their place. And by the way, putting them in their place means denying them of their nationality and their ability to be distinct. And if you deny people their ability to be Ukrainians, and this is not just language, this is all kinds of things, and killing them in large numbers, then that's genocide. So some people will date it back. Some people will say, I have colleagues who basically say, Russians have been out to to get rid of Ukrainians from the very beginning. And when, beginning is a hard one to talk about when that is again, but let's go back to the 19th century again, where there was this notion that we were all Russians and that any attempt, to institute Ukrainian distinctiveness was to be crushed, and sometimes physically crushed, deported, killed, that sort of thing, repressed. So it's a hard question. I mean, in my view, and again, I underline my, because historians will disagree. I mean, you know this as well as I do. Less about the facts of what happened than about how you interpret them. In my view, this was more Stalin in 1932-33. This was more the Soviet system. This was more about, the kind of fierce centralization motif, and within that, anti-Ukrainian views of Stalin and the Soviet leadership. In other words, they looked at the Ukrainians as inherently anti-Soviet. And in some ways, they were right.
Yeah.
These Ukrainian peasants just didn't want to go into the collective farms. They fought like the Dickens, against, there were outright battles in the countryside all over Ukraine. They fought like the Dickens, not to have to go into a collective farm. They were, and they were deported. I mean, Ukrainian kulaks, or kurkuls, as they're called in Ukrainian, were deported in hundreds of thousands, many of them shot, for their supposed, class basis as exploiters of labor. But in point of fact, they were shot because they were Ukrainians who didn't want to, deal with the Soviet system, or deported and eventually died in the Gulag, a lot of them. So, and the Ukrainian countryside then that starved, right? And this was especially bad in the winter of 32-33, being deprived of grain. I mean, they starved not because there was a bad harvest, but because the Soviets kept insisting on requisitioning grain from. And there were a series of these requisition campaigns where, these thugs and party people and sometimes poor peasants and sometimes people from the cities would go into out into the collective farms, and they would just, grab everything that was there. They'd open the larder and take it all. And there was nothing to eat. And the people died, again, by the hundreds of thousands, by the millions, just lying out on the fields, hungry. And there was enough grain in the Soviet Union to feed them. So that kind of attack on the Ukrainians, I think, is genocide, and comes from Moscow, but less from kind of Russians, at least in my view. This is going to be now. Now we have an example, of anti-Ukrainian activity on the part of the Russian government, which has nothing to do with Stalin, right? I mean, and communism. But in my view, what happened in 32-33 is not just one more episode, of anti-Ukrainian activity on the part of Moscow. Although it is that, right? I'm not saying it's not that, but it's special because of the whole Stalin centralization, collectivization motif from the early 1930s.
So again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but one way it seems you could kind of summarize it is, while all the characteristics of Stalin's plan seem to be from a different source, i.e. collectivization, etc., the eagerness by which some of his willing executioners executed it may have derived from that historical separateness that Russian, again, I'm trying not to overgeneralize, but that sense of separateness that was in this kind of collective psyche of some Russian people.
Right. That they just didn't like the fact that Ukrainians were trying to be Ukrainians and being different. Yeah, no, absolutely. and that they wanted their own form of, political and social organization, just like they do now. So,
Now, this is
so
a
I
bit
think
of an
it's part of a longer story, but the longer story doesn't explain it. I guess that's what I want what I want to say, and I'm still, you think about I worked on it. And I'll probably work on it again, but you're still trying to get the right balance, and it's hard. But I think the people on the other, like I said, I have colleagues, very good ones, who believe this was not genocide and this was not to get Ukrainians at all. And there, I think they're wrong. And so I'm on the kind of the Ukrainian side of the argument, but not fully. Where I think that the Russians are sort of always out to get Ukrainians, and the Russians are, deeply antagonistic to all Ukrainians, and so on and so forth. So that's not quite, So both stories, have to be balanced somehow appropriately.
Now, I'm going to go kind of take a little an aside, just so that people understand, how bad was the Holodomor? In other words, were there signs of, did people have to resort to cannibalism? Did they, just to give a sense of the scope, because that is something that certainly scarred the Ukrainian mindset.
Absolutely. It's it's a gash in Ukrainian history. I mean, it's fierce and awful and as bad as you can imagine. And by that, I mean, there was widespread cannibalism, which was known, in Moscow. They knew this was happening. There's something called necrophagy, which is basically, digging up corpses that are buried and eating them. People were wild, mad, driven crazy by hunger. So they would eat their own kids sometimes. Kill and eat.
Their dead children or actually kill their children?
Kill and eat, And it was terrible. It was really, really terrible. A colleague of mine, a famous historian named Robert Conquest, who was at the Hoover Institution for many years and has now passed away, wrote in his book about the Holodomor that this was one vast Belsen, bodies everywhere, just scattered.
I.e., like the concentration camp Belsen.
Yeah, the concentration camp. Just bodies, hunger, killing people. And by the way, as long as we're going to talk about Holodomor, there was a number of things about it that made it special in terms of the famine around the country. First of all, Ukrainians were not allowed to leave their villages. They couldn't go find food elsewhere. They couldn't go to the cities. I mean, some did make it to the cities, and we've got photographs, of bodies scattered, on the streets of Kharkiv and Kiev. People who make it to the cities, but they don't get enough food and they just die on the streets. They're not allowed to leave Ukraine. So there's more food elsewhere. So if they could have gotten to Belarus, then the Belarusian Republic, right? If they could have gotten there, there was food. If they could have gotten to Russia, there was food. But they wouldn't let them get on the trains. They wouldn't let them go. There were guard posts on the highways, that people couldn't leave. So they were stuck in a place where then they were deprived of food, and then these requisition people came in to get the last stuff. So it was really, it was hell, right? And people have written about it. There were, some people managed to survive and have written memoirs about it. We have, descriptions from various journalists who managed to get to the countryside and have told, what the story was. There were journalists, by the way, who also told the Soviet line and basically said nothing was going wrong. But that's the famous Walter Duranty of the New York Times. Remember that? Oh,
I'm definitely aware of him. Yeah,
that character, who got a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting from Russia. Well, from Soviet Union. They tried to take away his Pulitzer Prize, but I don't know if they actually did or not. Anyway, the long and the short of it is, your worst imagination is there. It was just a terrible, terrible scene, and you just feel for the Ukrainians. And by the way, this had effects, as every genocide does on survivor generations. It has psychological effects. There were a lot of physical effects. I mean, a lot of people were never the same after this. You say 4 million died, but think of all those people who came close to dying and managed to survive, and children whose brains were, development was injured and all that kind of stuff. And then the long-term kind of psychological effects on the Ukrainian nation. The fact that they went through this genocide in this way, and we know that these genocides have long-term psychological effects on multiple generations as you go through it. There are organizations, who still are dealing with it, with survivors, as it were, of a Holodomor, just as there were with the Holocaust and with, Rwanda and Bosnia and all these things, don't disappear just because the event goes. So, so in this case, the Holodomor, just because it ceased to be, in 1933, 34, the famine sort of came to an end. Soviets decided to deal with the countryside a little bit differently. They also killed a lot of people. And by the way, I should have mentioned when talking about genocide, they didn't just kill, not just peasants died, right? I mean, they actually took out and shot a lot of people. And the Ukrainians during the purges, let me get my light again. The Ukrainians during the purges, suffered terribly, disproportionately. And, the whole Ukrainian Communist Party was, everything. They wiped out the Ukrainian elite, school teachers and lawyers, and this kind of thing. So it was not just an attack on the countryside. The attack on the countryside was really incredibly brutal.
If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like, subscribe, and notification buttons. Additionally, if you have any feedback, please put something in the comments below. And lastly, if you want to watch the full episode of this clip, you can find it above. Thanks again for watching.